Hello, everyone. This is User from Backward Cache team, and
this is Rakina from Backward Cache team.
Today we are going to talk about this feature called Backward Cache. And what is Backward Cache, you may ask? So previously, when a user navigates away from the previous page is destroyed. And when they go back, the page's HTML must be repassed and re-rendered and everything, even with the HTTP cache. However, with this new feature, BFCache freezes the page instead, like when the page is navigated away, preserving all the DOM tree and JavaScript objects and user state, which allows the user to pick up exactly where they left off with the near instant navigation, as you can see in this GIF. So what is the current status of BFCache feature? Currently, initial version is shipped to Chrome M86, supporting the cross-site navigation, and it covers about 10 to 20% of all the history navigations, back and forth navigations. And we are trying to improve this coverage with same-site navigation support, in-flight network request support, and various web API supports, and increasing cache size and timeout, etc., which we're going to talk about later. So how does it work? First, we assess if the page is eligible for BFCache. So we can only put a page into BFCache if the page is independent of other pages, so that nothing can affect that page, like BFCached page, or get affected by the page while the page is in the BFCache. So most notably, this means that we don't cache pages when the pages have the opener relationships, like window.open. And also, we don't cache a page if a page uses unsupported features, which we're going to explain a little bit more later. And when we decide that a page is eligible for BFCache, we freeze the page, meaning that we freeze the task runners in a page. Basically, we stop running all the tasks for the frozen event loop for all the group of frames that are scriptable with each other. Actually, I gave a talk in previous BlinkOn about this specifically freezing, so please refer to the details to this previous talks. And this is unfortunate, but sometimes because freezing is not perfect, we might end up like evicting the page, meaning that giving up keeping the page into BFCache, and we just destroy that BFCache entry sometimes. And we will evict a page if we detect any kind of activity, such as script execution or IPC messages. This might happen because freezing is not perfect. And also, we destroy the BFCache entry when too much time passes. Currently, it's set to 3 minutes. And also when there are too much network activity. And this is what we're working on right now. Currently, if we have open connections, we don't cache, but we're trying to make it we're trying to support this. And also, we evict a page when a cache is full. Like currently, there is currently, we only cache one entry, but we are experimenting to increase more. So in an ideal case, we don't evict the page and we restore the page from the BFCache. So we unfreeze the page, resuming the task runner, and then display it as it was before it got into the BFCache. So this is how the magic instant navigation happens.
Okay, and so that all sounds nice and simple, but we did experience some challenges when before we're trying to ship the backward cache. Most importantly is the interactions between BFCache pages and web platform features. So the biggest thing about BFCache is we have the page cache, but so it's still there, it's still alive, although frozen and won't run anything. But we should pretend that it's not there at all. Like other pages should not be able to do things to it, and the BFCache page should not be able to do anything to other pages. And also, the BFCache page should not be able to see the state of the world or see things that are happening while it is in the BFCache. And I'm going to explain it in the next slides. So the first thing is the BFCache page should not be observable or do anything observable to the user and other pages. An example of this is how we support service workers. So a service worker cannot see clients or pages that are currently in BFCache through calling clients.get and clients.matchAll. And if it did have an old handle that it gets from clients.get previously when the page is not in BFCache, but the page is now BFCache, the handle will still be there. It will not be cleared. But if it tries to do anything to the page, to the BFCache page, we will evict the page from BFCache because the page should not do anything while in BFCache. And other than that is the BFCache page should not see the state of the outside world. What does that mean? So there are some cases where a page will receive events that are events even when the page is frozen. So for example, if the events come from the browser or other parts of the browser, like the network service, it should either drop the events or queue it and then dispatch the events later when the page gets navigated to again and gets restored from the BFCache. First example is when we should drop the events is Geolocation Api. So with Geolocation Api, it's possible to get updates from the browser on the current location, the latest location data. So yeah, the browser proactively sends the geolocation data to the renderer, to the page, but we should not send it to the page at all, and we should not queue them. Instead, we should just drop them because they should not be relevant while the page is in BFCache. And the other type is where we want to queue the messages and dispatch them and then work through them when the page gets restored and gets unfrozen. Is for example, is Inflight network requests. So we're currently adding support for this. If there's an active network request while the page is in BFCache, we will still keep reading the data while the page is BFCache, but we won't dispatch events or run scripts that depend on these events, so that we won't block the network service with all the data that's coming from the network request, but we will not do anything observable. And other than that, there are features that are harder to support because they have this type of traits, I guess. So they need more thought put into it. It's not always impossible to support these features, but we, instead of just the BFCache team deciding, oh yeah, for this feature we need to do this, we needed to talk to the owners of these features and determine whether it's possible for this feature to work with BFCache or not, and also how do we support it, and yeah, how should that work? So for example, Geolocation Api, as we mentioned before, it sends privacy sensitive information to the page. So we decided to drop those informations when the page is BFCache. And there's also when the feature might affect other pages like weblogs and IndexedDB. Like if they can, if a page that's about to be frozen holds a lock, it will still hold the lock while in BFCache. Then that can prevent other pages from getting the lock or things like that. And also APIs where you can send messages to pages and frames, like post message, broadcast channel. Also active connections, what should we do with them? WebRTC, web database, web USB, web Bluetooth. Those all have active connections, and other things that are just a bit complex and hard to freeze properly, like dedicated workers. We'll talk more about this in the following the later slides, but yeah, these are some examples of things that are hard and in some cases impossible to support with BFCache. Other than that, from the web platform perspective, there's also the before unload and unload events. So on normal navigations, we will fire both of these events before unload. That might result in the navigation getting canceled. And unload, that indicates that a page is about to be navigated away and will be destroyed. For navigations where the previous page gets into BFCache, however, we will only fire before unload, but not unload. This is because the page is never unloaded, it never gets destroyed. It instead gets cache. We keep it alive in the BFCache. And a lot of pages assume that the page will get discarded after unload and do like irreversible things like tear down various stuff that are not set up later on page show. This might break pages when they are kept in the BFCache and then later restored on history navigation. And so yeah, before unload will still get fired, but unload is never fired, even if we evict the page from BFCache at some point, because when we evict, we can't run script on the page because it's frozen and it is not the page that's currently shown, so should not run script. So even if a page does get unloaded or destroyed, the unload event is still never fired. We do have the page hide event, which is essentially unload event, but also gets fired on BFCache navigations. So the current recommendation is for web developers to always use page hide, never use unload. And this is a bit awkward, but Safari has been doing this for 10 plus years. Ever since Safari released BFCache, it's been doing this. But we still deem this as a risky change, and like 66% of page loads have unload handlers, which is very high. So it's quite risky. So we added some mitigations. We add some user level and enterprise level opt-out for BFCache, and also we're proposing an opt-out API for BFCache so that web developers can use it if they need to. And there's also some challenges from the Chrome architecture side. So as we previously mentioned, on navigations, pages are destroyed, but now they are preserved, but they're not active anymore, I guess. So they're not the current page, but they're still alive. And that kind of breaks some invariants in the Chrome code. And I'm not going to talk about that because that's talked about in the NPR talk already. So please see that. Okay. And we're going to talk about the next steps for BFCache from now. It shipped on M86, as we previously mentioned, but there are still improvements that we want to do. The first thing is the standardization of BFCache. So we talked about before unload and unload previously, and how Safari has not been firing unload for 10 years, but Firefox actually is more conservative and does not cache the page at all if the handles exist. And the spec didn't allow that behavior, kind of. And we've recently updated the HTML spec to allow this behavior in Safari, Chrome, and Firefox. So yay. But there are still general problems with unload, and we're actually kind of hoping that it gets deprecated in the future. So please look at the issues link when you have time. And also the opt-out API for BFCache. Currently, there's unofficial ways to make a page ineligible for BFCache, like cache control no store. but they're not actually spec. We kind of want to spec them, but also make sure that we don't like dig ourselves into a hole and preventing further improvements to BF Cache. So probably we're just gonna focus more on the official opt-out API for BF Cache. And the interesting part about that is we want to allow pages to opt out, but also not make it very easy so that it's abused. Like people are just adding it just because people are adding it, and then they lose performance gains because they just don't want to change unload to page height or something. Okay, other than that, small things to standardize that are not fully part of BF Cache, but affected by BF Cache. So browsing context group swaps is not spec in the it's not spec nicely in the HTML spec yet, but we kind of depend on that for our BF Cache to work, and we want to spec that. And navigation timing API, the V1 API does not work well with BF Cache at all. It doesn't change navigation start time when a page is restored from BF Cache, and we want to work on this for navigation timing V2 and other small things related to BF Cache behavior, like focus, timers, and some web platform tests didn't expect BF Cache, and we want to spec them.
Yes, so other than the standardization of BF Cache feature, our huge next step is to aim at more coverage. And actually, it's so all the BF Cache team and also browser developers and web developers have things to do to achieve this more coverage for BF Cache. So what do we need to do in terms of BF Cache team is support more features. So for some features, like we've already supported some features so that web developers don't have to do anything to make their pages BF Cache eligible. Like it's just transparent and the support is automatic. For example, geolocation or WebGL or Inflight network requests or service worker, like we've already implemented. We are implementing support for those features. So web developers don't really need to do anything. So that's what we are working on as a BF Cache team. And secondly, like browser developers, our favor for the web browser developers is to define the correct behavior of their features, because otherwise web developers we just want to define like what should be happening with BF Cache like as spec. So that's our favor. And also the third one is that web developers they sometimes need to change their websites to be BF Cache eligible. For example, the feature teardown is needed upon navigating away, such as page hide handlers to be BF Cache eligible. For example, like logs and web database, like it's very hard for BF Cache feature to support those features. So web developers need to implement the cleanup operations inside page hide handlers to make those pages BF Cache eligible. So that's an ask for web developers. And for BF Cache team, we are actively trying to support more features. For example, in-flight network requests, as we mentioned. Basically, what we are trying to do is keep running the task runners to process the responses and keep reading data and buffer them on the renderer side. But we just don't fire any events, or like we just don't do any web exposed actions such as dispatching events or resolving promises, etc. And also, we are trying to support popular APIs such as WebRTC, and we are trying to we are currently blocklisting the WebRTC feature, but then we're trying to unblock only when there are no actual active connections. And also WebGL, like one of the only concerns was memory, and we are trying to unblock this. Also, the third example is web file system or dedicated workers, and we are currently discussing how safe it will be to just unblock them. Like we just cache the pages with those features, and is that safe? Is there any privacy concerns or effect on other pages? And that's what we are discussing. For browser developers, please make your feature work with BFCache. One of the best scenarios is the support is transparent and automatic, meaning that web developers don't really need to do anything, such as Geolocation Api and other APIs like that. That would be the best because web developers don't really need to care about BFCache behavior. And the second best scenario is the page author handles the cleanup operations in page height handlers, such as locks. And it's not good at all if that feature, like your feature, blocks the page from entering the BFCache forever. So that is not good. So please try to make the feature like BFCache like compatible. This is what we're asking. And what should browser developers do is specify the interactions with BFCache, and specifically like define what the feature needs to do. Like should the connection be closed or like paused, etc. on navigation, where a page gets into BFCache instead of destroyed. And we are thinking about adding a step for this in the HTML spec to make this defining easier. So if we don't spec those behaviors, pages that are using this feature might not be eligible for BFCache, and that might hurt the adoption of your feature. Oh, like if this feature is not supported with BFCache, let's just not use this feature, kind of. So also, it's easier to specify this interaction or behavior early than to like look back and retrofit this into a shipped feature. So let's do this early. And an ask to web developers is to please make your pages work with BFCache. And one thing is that, as Rakina mentioned, please migrate the behavior in unload handler to page height handlers. And the second thing is to tear down or stop using block-listed APIs on page height handlers to ensure eligibility, to make your page BFCache eligible. And maybe moving things from load to page show. Wait, sorry.
So the load event will only be fired on the first navigation because the page is not unloaded, so it's only loaded at the first load. And so it's kind of like unload and page height. So just maybe move some things that you expect to run every time a page is navigated to from load to page show, because that's the BFCache compatible version of load.
Yes, so that's how you make your page work with BFCache. So how does the feature taildown look like? So currently, this is pretty unfortunate, but we currently judge the BFCache eligibility before running any handlers. So we are actively trying to fix this. We are trying to judge the BFCache eligibility after page height handlers, because otherwise, web developers' effort of this is like not considered. So currently we judge it like too early, but we're trying to make it later. And we are trying to make the eligibility check like after running all the handlers, so the pages can clean up the feature or tear down the feature to make the pages BFCache eligible inside page height handlers, just like in this example of like inside page height handler, you can, for example, release the lock to make the page BFCache eligible, and maybe setting up things again in the page show handlers. Another thing is that we are working on the Devtools support. We are trying to add a new feature on Devtools, which tries the BFCache navigation on the page. If you click this button, like it just does the BFCache navigation. And was it working? Like was the page BFCached? And we show the reasons why like the page was not BFCached, like, and there are some action items like for web developers to do, like, for example, please tear down a feature in page height handler like this. Yeah, this is the feature that we are implementing right now in order to make it easier for web developers to make their pages BFCache eligible. So that's all we have. Any questions?
Alexander in the future will answer them. Okay, bye.
So, thanks, Yuzu and Regina, for this talk. I think we are a little bit out of time, but I'm happy to take any questions and talk about this more if you're interested, either here or on Slack.
Yeah, one question. Do we have any sort of performance data from the wild? How much it improved, like overall experience for users?
Yes, we do. It's not particularly conclusive yet because I think that there might be some other bugs in metrics which might prevent us from sort of capturing very accurate data. But sort of we have implemented core web vitals metrics, all three metrics for BFCache navigations. So we know how fast they are, and we know that they are sort of pretty fast.
Okay.
Expected.
Maybe one more thing we should add on that, just to convince you why this is such a big deal. I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Alexander, but I think it's fair to say that with BFCache, we see that people engage with the web more. And so
yes.
We can see that the user experience is improving to a point that people are measurably doing more, which is a huge deal, really big deal, I think.
So yes, I'm personally really looking forward to the improvements. And when we get the hit rate up, it will be very exciting to see how much it actually improves and how much new navigations we will get from it.
Another question, maybe half jokingly, is there going to be machine learning to determine when we evict things from the cache?
I think it's a great idea. I think we'll talk more about this in the future, but for now we have more low-hanging fruit to address. +1 to Kentaro. Sort of, it's a cherry on top of the cake, but we are still in the process of building the cake.
I have a question about freezing. So it was mentioned that freezing isn't perfect and that there are some cases where we might not actually freeze. Is that just a matter of like amount of effort? Like, do you see us ever getting to a point where maybe freezing could be perfect or near perfect? Or is there just some fundamental reason we can't do it?
So I don't know if Kentaro wants to talk about this, but there is no reason why it can't be perfect. And actually, there is a project underway in Tokyo called multiple blink isolates, which will greatly improve the situation there. So the problem now is that not all tasks are associated with the frames, and we still have a bunch of per-thread tasks running JavaScript, and it's a question of eliminating them.
I wanted to ask, have you seen issues with low-end devices using BFCache? I imagine this leaves some memory footprint.
This indeed a very good question, and it very much depends on how much memory the device has. At the moment, we are shipping a version for cross-site. Yes, and there each time we navigate, we do a cross-process navigation. So, and on Android, that means that you have a process which can be killed by the OS if the need arises. But yes, I think overall we are targeting devices mostly, I think, 2 GB and above.
So using this technology, you could also think of something like creating snapshots of your current renderer fork it, and then you would have a snapshot that you can return to, right? So for example, if I'm browsing and I want to persist the state I'm currently in, I click on a button, it creates a snapshot, and I can continue to do things, but then I can return to that snapshot again as well. Is that something that makes sense?
So yeah, so that's a super challenging project. So because there is a fundamental distinction between in memory versus on disk. So we can already do that in memory by using this BFCache technology, but in order to restore and save to disk, so this is a separate project, and that's super challenging.
No, I'm not even thinking about persisting to disk because, yeah, serialization is going to be a problem. But what if I just want to have an undo button for browsing?
Problem's probably like most websites talk to a server in some way, right? You know, I mean, maybe if the website agreed to it, but you could totally imagine that causing a bunch of weird state consistency issues with whatever state's stored on a server. It's a fun idea, though.
So I think this web platform is complex and we're shipping new APIs. And something like that will sort of impose a huge maintenance cost on all of these APIs. As Rick mentioned, it's both cases when we talk to the outside world through network and other things. It's also the renderer having module connections to other parts of the Chrome base. So unfortunately, as Kentaro mentioned, I think Tokyo architecture team looked at this a few years ago, and unfortunately, this is super challenging.
Okay, thanks. Exciting stuff, nevertheless.
Rakina and Yuzu touched on this a little bit, but can you summarize a bit more about how our implementation differs from the other browsers?
I don't think it's a question that is possible to summarize, because the problem with BFCache, the fundamental problem, is that it affects the whole web platform. That pretty much every single feature on web platform somehow interacts with BFCache, and all the usually small details of this interaction are different between sort of browsers. So summary in a lot of small details. On the good part, so we are looking into that, we are talking with other browser vendors, and we are getting the situation better. And sort of as we are unblocking more features, we are sort of also looking into how we can align with other vendors.
Yeah, and at some point, I think so we should integrate some clear guideline into the API owner reviews. So because web platform APIs need to be aware of how it should behave with BFCache. So we are working on the guideline at the moment.
Interesting, thanks. They mentioned updating some web platform tests. You meant like all these different details of browsers are slightly different. Are we embarking on a path to slowly like chip away at getting tests and spec changes
I think slowly but surely, yes. So I think we've been mostly working on the existing tests, fortunately, because this feature has been shipped on sort of Safari and Firefox. Some tests already exist, and some spec coverage exists. So we sort of we are not starting from scratch, but yes, we will be sort of slowly improving the situation, hopefully.
I think this is a good example of a feature that, like, a very simplistic view might lead someone to say, oh, we can't ship this until we do an awful lot of spec work. It's kind of convenient that other browsers, even Mozilla, who tends to be quite strict about, having only well-defined behavior in their browser, has long ago shipped Oh, it's kind of nice that we could follow them on that without holding a too high of a bar.
It sounds like there's a bit of a call to action to website owners to update their sites to work best with BFCache. What have you done, or what are you planning to do to evangelize this feature to website developers?
I think we started this yesterday or the day before yesterday with publishing a web.dev article on BFCache, where Philip went into sort of a great detail and explained what BFCache is, how it impacts the features and sites, and what you should do. I think we'll build on top of that.
Presumably, we'll ramp that up once we have more support for developers available, like the Devtools support, for example. Yes. I think what I've heard, if I was a web developer working on some large site, I feel like I wouldn't have the tools to know even really where to start just yet.
I have spent quite a lot of time just lurking through the web for various resources on BFCache and explanations of what BFCache is and how it is in the other browsers. So I think this web.dev article is, I think, the single biggest update since a couple of articles about page cache from Safari's blog almost 10 years ago. I think that's already a huge improvement.
Do we have any data on what the hit rate of other browsers are? Like how often they fail to use their BFCache implementations?
So Safari is not going to know, I don't think, because they won't collect that sort of information. Firefox, maybe. If Firefox has a bunch of public stats available, so I don't know if we could go looking to see if they have telemetry for this.
So yes, I think the short answer, we don't know the exact figures. We can make some assumptions. So I think for Firefox, it's going to be on the lower side because they do not cache pages with unload handlers, and that already constitutes 2/3 of all page loads on the web. And for Safari, we know that they have done a bunch of work recently to increase their hit rate and allow more pages to be stored on the cache. I have no information, but I presume that they are getting their metrics somewhere.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's not 100%, because if it's 100%, then obviously they wouldn't invest in telling developers about it because it's transparent and they don't have to worry about it anymore. Mm-hmm.
I think you should expect that Apple probably has a benchmark that they run, right? They have a set of pages that they run, that they test on. That's generally how they optimize things, where we generally look at data from the wild.
Thanks for the great questions, and thanks for the great discussion. And big thanks again to User and Regina for putting this presentation together. Thank you.